Those who watch my YouTube videos will know that I've made quite a few ride videos featuring this AJS 250 from 1939. I've made a couple of videos very recently and more over the last few years, and I think I've probably worked on this bike on and off for the owner as and when required over perhaps nearly the last 10 years now. It all started with him wanting me to check it over and make sure it was reliable for long distances, etc. But then it soon escalated into, could I make it go any faster for him? And from there on, that's when all the fun started. And there have been so many things done to this machine over the recent years, it's difficult to remember them all. But basically, we've got two complete engines, plus a spare bottom end. There's two Ajs cylinder heads, and there's also an aerial 250 cylinder head that I've used on it, which we'll have a look at in a moment. I've probably tried about half a dozen different carburetors on it, including AML monoblocks, pre-monoblocks, horizontal pre-monoblocks. We even, at the owner's request, had a McCuney on it at one time. We found a TT carburetor wouldn't fit between the head and the oil tank, but there's probably been about half a dozen combinations of carburetors on it, and all sorts of different jettings and so on. Camshafts, we've had about 4 or 5 different sets of those, all run on different timings, and what's currently in it are actually a copy of the Royal Enfield Redditch S pattern cams, which I've timed to suit the engine, and I've also had to time the valves to clear the high dome on the high compression piston, which again, the piston is one of about 3 or 4 different ones we've had in there. We've had a couple of gearboxes with close ratio gears and standard ratio gears, just about anything and everything you can think of, and even about 3 or 4 speedometer clocks on it, just in case there was any inaccuracies there. And the bottom line is, the conclusion I can draw from it all, is the pre-war Ajs 250 is a lovely bike, but not really very tunable, in that we've made it quicker, but it's never going to be a road burner. It's probably about 5 or 10 miles an hour faster than it was originally, but it's never going to do 100 miles an hour. It's no Rudge or anything like that, for example, and I think you're a little bit restricted by the small bore and the long stroke characteristics of it, among other things, but we got it running very nicely, and I think that really the owner's going to have to settle for that. But down here I've got a couple of cylinder heads, and this one is the Ajs cylinder head, which is the same as what's on there now, but from the other engine, of course. And this one is an aerial 250 cylinder head from the pre-war era, which I managed to fit quite easily because the stud centres are the same. I fitted it along with the aerial pushrod tubes, which just happened to be the right length to mate up with the crankcase, the Ajs crankcase. We're now back to Ajs pushrods, of course, there. And Royal Enfield 250 Crusader pushrods connected the Ajs bottom end to the aerial rocker gear quite nicely. The reason I wanted to use the aerial head, or give it a try, was, you can't really see it too well perhaps, but the diameter of the combustion chamber on the aerial head is slightly smaller than on the Ajs. The Ajs head actually overhangs the diameter of the piston by quite a margin, and would be more suited to something with a bigger bore. The aerial head more closely matches the bore diameter, and I felt that we were getting a sort of opposite of a squish effect with the Ajs head, where there were no such losses with the aerial one. And the flip side of it is, you can see that the aerial cylinder head inlet valve is ever so slightly smaller than the Ajs. So we were sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul, really, and the exhaust pipe didn't fit quite right on the engine when the aerial head was on it, because the angle of the port is a little bit different. So after discussions with the owner, we decided to go back to the Ajs head, and it's a bit more fitting really for quite a rare old bike to sort of all be 100% as it should be, rather than a bitzer. Although it's been interesting trying all these things, and there aren't many owners about that would allow it, never mind encourage it. But we've covered a lot of ground with this one over the years and put a lot of effort in just to get a very, very small improvement at the end of it. And at least we know now, or I know now, that if I ever had to work on another one and liven it up a little, most of the original Ajs stuff could stay put on it. But a bit of porting work to the cylinder head and revised camshafts go a long way to helping it without doing much else. What else can I say about this machine? The cylinder head fitted has actually got Royal Enfield valves and guides in it, and the Royal Enfield valves and guides are very useful because these have got the valves that they would have had originally in them. And you can see on this Ajs head that the Ajs valves, the stems are a very, very thick diameter on the valves, and the Royal Enfield valve guides have a very large outside diameter, but the valves themselves, the Royal Enfield valves, have a slimmer stem than a lot of vintage engines did. So that means that the Royal Enfield valve guides can often be made to fit in place of original vintage valve guides, usually by machining their outside diameters down a little to get them to fit the head. And then you find that the Royal Enfield valves can usually be made to go in, sometimes being reduced in diameter slightly to match up to any seating diameters or whatever, and you end up with a set of valves in a vintage head with slimmer stems, which also helps the breathing. And just the valves and the guides themselves can get you out of trouble when you're trying to replace worn, obsolete parts. And I've done that on quite a few. I've done it on, as I say, this cylinder head's got them. I did it with a vintage Triumph TT cylinder head. I've done it with a vintage Norton Model 18, and many, many more actually. So that's a good little thing to know. If ever you're short of valves and guides for your vintage engine, try a set of Royal Enfield guides and machine them to fit, and then you can get your valves from Royal Enfield quite easily and quite cheaply, and you're back in business again. Anyway, I thought I'd make this video because I've made short commentaries before a ride on it or after a ride, but there's so much to say about this machine. I thought it warranted a video in itself, and I think I've done everything I can with it now. It just needs a little bit of running in because I rebuilt it. It's actually got a lightened crank, this bottom end. There's another engine for it which has got the standard bottom end, but the flywheels in this engine probably been lightened by about £1.50 or so to try and liven up the acceleration a little. So that's what we've got in this one. We're running a very high compression ratio. I think it might be nudging about 10 to 1 actually. Like I say, a mildly ported head, Royal Enfield S-pattern cams, timed to suit the engine requirements and keep the valves out the way of the piston, and it does seem to go quite well. So I'll be leaving it at that, but here we are. We've got a complete running 1939 Ajs 250 Model 22, which I think just needs a little bit of running in now, and then hopefully it'll be ready to go home.